When Jason Statham walked into an upscale London restaurant, he just wanted to enjoy dinner. But the waiter was against it. A few minutes later, the expensive furniture was flying away, and the criminals were already regretting that they had decided to challenge the wrong person. Dear viewer, subscribe and like it, so you can show me if you liked the story or not. The night enveloped the city in the soft glow of neon signs, and the streets of Los Angeles were flooded with the warm glow of streetlights. In the distance, the dull bass of club music, the noise of expensive cars, and the occasional conversation of drunk passers-by could be heard. Among the luxurious skyscrapers, glittering shop windows and black cars with tinted windows, one of the most elite restaurants in the city, La Couronne, was located. This restaurant wasn't just a place to have dinner. It was a status symbol. Hollywood stars, billionaires, politicians, and the elite of the criminal world dined here. It was almost impossible to book a table unless you were part of a select group. The service was impeccable, the food was a work of art, and the staff's level of snobbery was off the charts. A stern doorman in a perfectly pressed suit stood near the entrance, watching each guest like a Cerberus guarding the gates to paradise for the rich. Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, and Maybach were parked nearby, and well-groomed men in expensive suits and women in luxurious evening dresses got out of the cars. In this flawless painting, a man appeared who clearly did not fit into the environment. Jason Statham got out of the black SUV, tossed the keys to the valet, and sauntered toward the entrance. He was wearing a black leather jacket, a plain gray t-shirt, and dark jeans. On his feet were comfortable boots, in which he could both ride a motorcycle and kick down doors. No brands, no ostentatious accessories, just calm confidence in every move. He went to the door, but the doorman leaned forward slightly, blocking the entrance. "I'm sorry, sir, but it looks like you've got the wrong place," he said coldly, glancing at him. Statham stopped for a second, looked from the doorman to the huge glass door, through which the luxurious interior of the restaurant could be seen, and then looked back at the guard. "No, I came exactly where I wanted to go," he replied calmly, without changing his expression. The doorman didn't budge. "Our institution has a strict dress code. We can't let you in like this." Statham grinned. "Are you suggesting I go back to the hotel and put on a tuxedo?" The doorman didn't blink. "Perhaps you should look for a more suitable place for your style." At this point, the restaurant manager intervened in the conversation. He was a thin man in a perfectly fitting suit, with delicate features and an overly smug smile. He seemed to be enjoying the moment. "Good evening, sir. I think our dear doorman has already explained the situation to you. We don't want to inconvenience you, but La Couronne is a restaurant for a certain category of customers." Statham inhaled slowly, as if giving himself a second to think. He could have just turned around and left, but instead he took out his phone, dialed a short number, and put the receiver to his ear. The manager and the doorman watched him in disbelief. "Hey, Danny, I'm here at your restaurant, but it looks like I'm not welcome." There was an answer on the phone, and after a couple of seconds, Statham nodded with a grin. "Yeah, well then I'll see you in 5 minutes." He put the phone in his pocket, took a step forward, and looked the manager straight in the eye. "It seems that you will have another guest soon. I hope he doesn't have to explain the dress code." The manager tensed internally, but tried to keep a smug expression. "I'm afraid rules are rules," he said, but his voice was already sounding less confident. Statham just nodded, stepped aside, and leaned against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest. Now it was just a matter of waiting. Exactly 5 minutes later, a black Bentley pulled up on the street. A man in an elegant suit got out, followed by 2 massive guards. As he headed for the entrance, the doorman immediately opened the doors for him. "Good evening, Mr. Delacroix." The manager bowed his head respectfully, but Delacroix ignored him. He walked right up to Jason, slapped him on the shoulder, and smiled broadly. "Jason, old boy, it's good to see you. I hope you like it here." The manager was stunned. "Do you know each other?" Delacroix slowly turned his head in his direction and looked at him as if he were something insignificant. "Is it your job to decide who can enter and who can't?" The manager swallowed convulsively. "Well, it's just that we..." Did I express myself badly? Delacroix interrupted him coldly. The manager realized that he had backed himself into a corner. His face changed abruptly. He smiled ingratiatingly and took a step back. Oh, of course. Just a little misunderstanding. Please come in. Delacroix grinned and waved his hand towards the entrance. Jason, let's go. Dinner is on me. Statham stepped inside without looking at the manager, who was already sweating profusely. Oh, by the way, he said over his shoulder. Your service here isn't very good. The restaurant greeted him with luxurious interiors, muted music and the aromas of delicious dishes. The customers at the tables looked at him with interest and surprise, and he just walked by, as if he always belonged here. All he knew was that tonight was just beginning. Jason Statham confidently strode through the hall of the restaurant La Couronne, leaving behind the manager, who still could not believe what had happened. The guests at the table stole glances at the man in the leather jacket, trying to figure out what a man who clearly did not fit into the atmosphere of an elite establishment was doing here. The soft light of crystal chandeliers, golden patterns on the walls, snow-white tablecloths and muted music created an atmosphere of sophistication and wealth. There was a light scent of truffles and expensive wines in the air. La Couronne was famous not only for its cuisine, but also for its impeccable service, which was brought to the level of art. Everything worked like a Swiss mechanism here, if, of course, you corresponded to the status of the institution. Statham took a seat at a table by the window overlooking Los Angeles at night. Delacroix sat down across from him and wasted no time snapping his fingers at the waiter. We have the best wine from your cellar. And, of course, a special menu for my guest, he said, smiling. The waiter, a young guy with perfectly coiffed hair and snobbery in his eyes, only now realized that one of the guests was the same person who had recently been tried to get out the door. He hesitated for a second, but quickly regained his self-confident look. Of course, Mr. Delacroix, he said, and then turned to Statham and, with a slight tilt of his head, added, Can I get you a beer? Delacroix raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Statham looked at the waiter with a slight grin. What makes you think I drink beer? The guy shrugged, trying to look innocent. Well, I just assumed that you would be more comfortable with something simpler. Statham nodded. Then I can guess something, too. For example, that you will stop working here in a couple of minutes. The waiter blinked, but quickly gathered himself. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, he said, but there was a hint of mockery in his voice. Statham leaned back in his chair, tilted his head, and said calmly, Do you know how to serve wine properly? The waiter frowned slightly, not understanding what the guest was getting at. Of course, sir. Great, then show me. The waiter tensed slightly, but there was nothing to do. He left, and returned a minute later with a bottle of aged Chateau Margaux, worth several $1,000s. He carefully picked up the corkscrew, pulled out the cork with a light pop, then picked up the glass and slowly began to pour the wine. Statham watched his every move, and then, when the glass was almost full, he suddenly spoke. Wait, the waiter froze. Is something wrong? Statham looked him straight in the eye. You poured me a full serving, so you have no idea how to serve wine properly. The waiter pursed his lips. Excuse me? If you pour wine to a guest, you must first pour a small portion for tasting, and then wait for him to confirm that he is satisfied with the taste and aroma. And only after that you fill the glass. But you didn't do it. So either you're inexperienced or you're just being inconsiderate. Delacroix held back a grin as he watched the waiter's face turn slightly red. I think you're exaggerating a little. The guy tried to justify himself. No, I just know exactly how a professional should work, Statham replied calmly. He picked up the glass, took a sip and put it back on the table. Now you have two options. The first, you're learning how to do your job properly. Second, you continue to look down on your customers, and then you're unlikely to stay here for long. The waiter nodded convulsively and, muttering something like, Have a nice evening, hurriedly left. Delacroix laughed softly and shook his head. You could have just ignored him, but no, you definitely had to put him in his place. Statham shrugged his shoulders. I don't like it when people judge by their appearance. Well, Then you're in the wrong place, my friend, Delacroix chuckled, taking a sip of wine. This restaurant is one big showcase of vanity. Statham did not reply. He was just enjoying the moment, listening to the slight noise of the restaurant and watching the waiter nervously talking to his colleagues. The incident seemed to be over. But at that moment, the restaurant's door was abruptly flung open. All eyes instantly turned to the entrance. 3 masked men with guns burst into the hall. One of them shot into the air. Everyone on the floor. This is a robbery. A scream rang through the restaurant. The guests fell to the floor. The waiters fled in panic. The restaurant manager paled and backed up to the counter, typing the alarm code on his phone with trembling hands. But in the midst of all this chaos, there was one person who didn't move. Statham sat quietly in his seat, holding a glass of wine in his hands. One of the robbers noticed this, pointed a gun at him and barked. "Are you deaf?" "On the floor," I said. Statham slowly set his glass down on the table, then looked at Delacroix. "Do you think they know who they're robbing?" Delacroix just grinned. "They'll figure it out soon enough." The robber took a step forward, not understanding why this man was not afraid of him. "Are you really?" But he didn't finish his sentence. Statham abruptly raised his hand and grabbed the nearest table knife. It was the beginning of a game in which the robbers didn't stand a chance. The La Couronne restaurant smelled of expensive wine mixed with a light scent of fear. The guests and waiters pressed themselves to the floor, not daring to raise their heads. The robbers had everyone at gunpoint, but their hands were shaking. They tried to look confident, but one thing was clear in their eyes. They did not expect resistance. But one person didn't look scared. Jason Statham. He was sitting at the table, leisurely swinging a glass of wine in his hand. There was absolute confidence in his gaze. The look of a man who knows exactly what's going to happen in the next few minutes. The gang leader, a man with a rough face and tattoos on his neck, pointed a gun at him. "Did I say something wrong?" "On the floor, you freak." Statham looked at him, then took a small sip of wine, as if deciding if the bouquet of the drink was good enough. "You should work on your manners," he said calmly. The robber frowned. "What? When you enter a restaurant, you first say hello, then you book a table. You're not waving a gun like a loser." There was silence in the room. The leader took a step forward, clutching the pistol in his hand. "You don't seem to understand who's in charge here." He pressed the barrel to Statham's forehead. Jason sighed. "The problem is that you don't understand it yourself." And before the robber could pull the trigger, Statham grabbed his wrist with lightning speed, turned the gun up and punched him sharply in the solar plexus. The leader wheezed and doubled over. "Mistake number 1. Never come so close to me." Statham jerked his arm down, forcing him to drop the weapon, and then hit his elbow in the temple. The leader fell to his knees. "Mistake number 2. You chose the wrong person to threaten." The other robbers froze and then simultaneously rushed to attack. The first one ran up from the left, trying to hit with the butt of a pistol. But Statham was already moving. He stepped aside, grabbed the attacker's arm and twisted it sharply, causing the gun to shoot into the floor. Then he hit his opponent hard in the neck with the edge of his palm. He wheezed, sank to the floor, clutching at his throat. The second robber jumped over the table, holding a tire iron in his hands. Statham met his blow by grabbing his opponent's wrist, and then forcefully threw him over his shoulder. The man crashed onto the glass table with a crash, which shattered into thousands of pieces. "You just broke $20,000 worth of furniture." Statham grinned, striding forward. "You'll be billed." The last remaining robber took out a knife in a panic and rushed at Statham, brandishing the blade. "You're dead, do you hear?" Statham dodged the first blow, grabbed the man's wrist and twisted his arm, causing the knife to fall out. Then, without letting the opponent come to his senses, he delivered a series of quick blows, an elbow to the jaw, a fist to the stomach, and then a sharp uppercut that threw the opponent into the air before he collapsed to the floor. Deathly silence. The restaurant's guests, who had been hiding under the tables a minute ago, were now watching with wide-open eyes. Statham adjusted the sleeves of his leather jacket and looked at the robbers lying in agony. Delacroix, who had been watching the whole thing with a smirk, slowly stood up and applauded loudly. "Jason, old man, you made my night." The restaurant manager, still pale as a sheet, ran up to them. "Mr. Statham, I do not know how to thank you." "Start with a free dinner," he chuckled. But their conversation was interrupted by the sound of sirens. Statham sighed and shook his head. Now the problems will begin. The doors of the restaurant burst open with a bang, and police officers ran inside with guns at the ready. "Everyone stay where you are." Statham raised his hands, but grinned at the same time. "Officers, I can explain." The hum of sirens drowned out the noise of the street. Red and blue flashes were reflected in the huge panoramic windows of the La Couronne restaurant, making the lighting inside harsh and chaotic. The first wave of police officers rushed through the broken door, guns pointed at the center of the hall. "Everyone stay where you are. Hands up, quickly," an officer in a bulletproof vest shouted. Jason Statham slowly raised his hands. His face remained impassive. The robbers lay prostrate behind him. Some were writhing in pain. Some had already lost consciousness. Broken tables, shards of expensive glass, randomly scattered dishes. The whole restaurant resembled a scene from an action movie. The manager of the establishment, swallowing nervously, took a step forward. "Officer, this is some kind of misunderstanding. These people, they tried to rob us. And this man saved us all." The policeman stared at Statham. "The name?" Jason tilted his head slightly, as if debating whether to answer. "Jason Statham," he finally said, with a slight accent that made every word weightier. One of the officers standing behind cursed softly. Obviously, he recognized the name. The policeman holding the pistol at gunpoint slowly lowered it, then took out a walkie-talkie and muttered something quickly. "Damn. I thought he was just a legend." Statham heard someone whisper, but the chief officer was still wary. He motioned for the others to check on the robbers, and one of the policemen crouched down next to the gang leader, who was still holding onto his broken wrist. It's him. This psycho, this bastard. He broke my arm." The leader wheezed, gasping in pain. Statham smiled out of the corner of his mouth. "You broke it yourself, buddy." "Yeah. And how did it happen?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "Wrong choice of restaurant." One of the policemen chuckled, but quickly restrained himself. The leader tried to stand up, but immediately collapsed back, grimacing in pain. "This is an attack. You have to arrest him." The officer looked at the restaurant's guests, who began to come out of hiding. One of them, a man in an expensive suit, took a step forward. "Officer, this man saved our lives. We can confirm that it was these scum who attacked." The woman in the evening dress nodded vigorously. "He acted like a real hero." The policeman looked at Statham, then back at the wrecked restaurant. He clearly understood that everything had happened for a reason. "Okay, Mr. Statham, can you explain what happened here?" Jason sighed, lowered his arms slightly, and took a step forward. "Well, it all started with the fact that I ordered a steak." The policeman blinked. "What?" They have a good rib, I hear, with a thin layer of fat around the edges, juicy, medium-rare roast." Delacroix, who had been standing off to the side all this time, grinned and crossed his arms over his chest. "To be honest, it was a great evening until these guys decided to ruin everything." The officer ran a hand over his face, clearly restraining his irritation. "Mr. Statham, that's fine, of course, but what about the case?" Jason shrugged his shoulders. "It's a simple matter. They broke in, started threatening, and I decided it would ruin my dinner. So I cleaned up a bit." The gang leader growled. "It wasn't just order. The psycho beat the crap out of us." "Not all of it, it seems." Statham grinned. The policeman looked at him, then at the criminals lying down. He was clearly hesitating. Then something crackled in the radio, and a voice from the speaker said, "Confirmed. The Gorgon group. Wanted for 3 armed assaults. Take them." The officer slowly lowered the radio and nodded to his men. "Have you been listening? Pack them up." The police began to handcuff the bandits. The leader tried to resist, but his arms were immediately twisted. "You're kidding. That bastard should be in handcuffs." Not us. Statham chuckled. Bad day, buddy. The leader spat blood on the floor. Do you think that's all? Do you think I do not know who you are? We'll meet again, do you hear? Statham did not look away, even as the robber was being led away. I'll be waiting. The officer turned to him and sighed. Okay, Mr. Statham. I think you got lucky today. But try not to arrange gladiatorial fights in the center of London anymore. Jason nodded and smiled slightly. Trying doesn't mean promising. The policeman shook his head and headed for the exit. The rest of the guests began to come out of hiding. The waiters carefully lifted the broken dishes. The manager approached Statham and nervously wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. We don't know how to thank you, Mr. Statham. It was unbelievable. Delacroix smiled and patted his friend on the shoulder. Just add his bill to the total bill of the restaurant. The manager immediately nodded. Oh, of course, on the house. Whatever you want. Statham sat back down at the table, picked up the menu, and idly flipped through the pages. Then let's start over. Bring me a ribeye. The manager paled. But the kitchen is temporarily closed after such an incident. Statham looked up slowly. The manager swallowed nervously. I'll fix it now. He disappeared with incredible speed. Delacroix laughed. As always, you know what you want. Of course, Statham replied, leaning back in his chair. After all, a good dinner is sacred. The lights of the police cars were still flashing outside the restaurant, but inside La Couronne, life returned to normal.